Iran and Russia embroiled in conflicts that appear to have no end. The Islamic Republic still threatening to attack Israel, and Russia now pounding Ukraine after Kyiv launched a stunning operation to take the war back onto the territory that launched it. Moscow and Tehran see the wars in Ukraine and Israel as linked. Why is that? And what will Iran do next? We'll be speaking with Greg Brew of the Eurasia Group. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. With me to discuss this topic is Greg Brew. Greg, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been very critical of Iran. He views Islamic Republic officials as being partly responsible for the suffering in Ukraine. Now, there appears to be a link between the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Iran and Israel conflict. How would you characterize that linkage?
Well, I think from the point of view of Iran, Russia's war in Ukraine has offered it something of an opportunity. Iran sees itself as being surrounded by enemies, the most powerful being Israel and, of course, the United States. And Russia's war in Ukraine and Russia's increasing isolation from the international community, the weight of Western sanctions, U.S. support for Ukraine, and Russia's need for increased weapons, increased arms for its war in Ukraine, has offered Iran a way to increase its leverage, get a closer relationship with Moscow, largely through by serving as Russia's sort of new source of armaments. There, of course, have been multiple reports of Iran selling drones to Russia, assisting Russia in establishing a drone factory. There have been recent reports of Iran potentially selling ballistic missiles to Russia, although these remain somewhat unconfirmed. And at the same time, Iran and Russia have grown closer together. They're not really allies in the conventional sense, but there is certainly a strategic partnership, a strategic relationship that is forming, albeit slowly, between Russia and Iran. Now, from the point of view of Iran, this does affect its confrontation with Israel and the ongoing Middle East crisis that began on October 7th with the Hamas attack against Israel. Iran is conscious that it faces a conventional mismatch, if you like, in terms of military capabilities. Israel and the United States have much more powerful conventional militaries than Iran, so Iran is always looking for sources of additional deterrence, additional support. And one potential source of support is Russia. The closer Iran can pull Russia towards itself, the closer that it can form that new relationship, arguably the greater its deterrence against potential Israeli or U.S. attack. So from the point of view of Tehran, that's how these two conflicts are connected. That's how they form part of Iran's broader foreign policy.
Now, in terms of the strategic relationship, who's the boss here? Are they equal, or is one controlling the other?
Well, I think when you look at the balance sheet, Russia is a much more significant, much more powerful state than Iran. Obviously, it's a much larger country. Its industrial base is considerably larger. Its military is far more powerful. Russia has a significant nuclear arsenal. Iran is a threshold nuclear state, but does not yet possess nuclear weapons. And in the past, Iran has often gone to Russia and looked for support, looked for increased assistance. It is currently trying to obtain more high-tech weapon systems from Russia, and Russia at oftentimes has sort of tried to keep Iran at arm's length. As I mentioned, one of the reasons why Iran has been able to pull Russia somewhat closer to it is the fact that Russia has needed support. It's needed arms. It's looked to Iran for support in its war in Ukraine, chiefly through buying and supplying drones, which Russia has been using in large numbers to bombard Ukrainian cities. At the same time, Russia's growing isolation from the West, from the United States, from the major developed countries, has put it in a somewhat more awkward position where it's looking in other directions for support. Russia is looking to China. It's selling large amounts of oil to India. And it does look to Iran for increased support given its new position. So there's been something of a shift in the balance. Russia is still the much more powerful state, but Iran has a little bit more leverage than it did before the war in Ukraine began.
And given that leverage, could Iran potentially be calling the shots for anything between Russia's decisions to do anything in Ukraine and vice versa? Or could Russia be calling the shots with Iran when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war?
Well, I think there's push and pull in both directions. When we're thinking about, who the decision maker is, I think Iran and Russia both bring their distinct interests to the table, and they see how best they can cooperate in pursuit of mutual interests. In some areas, their interests don't align. For instance, Russia has been trying to maintain something of a balanced position in the Middle East. We did see reports following the likely Israeli assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. There were visits by Russian dignitaries to Tehran, and there were reportedly messages sent by Vladimir Putin to Iran's leadership to hold back on retaliating against Israel. Russia is conscious of relations with the Gulf states, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, and others. So when it comes to, who's calling the shots, I think it sort of depends on which conflict is key, which relationship is in the central focus. And I should stress, even though they're growing closer together, even though this is the makings of a strategic partnership, Russia and Iran are not yet allies. They are, of course, historical foes. In the 19th century, Iran lost large amounts of territory to Russia, was repeatedly invaded, and was at war with Russia, was occupied by the Soviet Union during World War II. So there is not, love lost in that relationship. They are friends by necessity and friends by opportunity, but not yet close allies who cooperate across the board on foreign policy.
Could that change, like going forward into 2025, 2026, looking ahead? In terms of Iran and Russia's strategy, will they go deeper into each other's proxy wars?
This is a very interesting question because I think it hinges in large part on what happens in these two distinct conflicts. The conflict in Ukraine is likely to go through something of a transition in 2025. Regardless of who wins the U.S. presidential election in November, there is likely to be a shift in how the United States perceives the war in Ukraine and perceives the necessity or the pressure to provide increased or continued military support to Ukraine. 2025 could see increased pressure towards some kind of ceasefire, or at least a cessation in hostilities, creating some kind of balance or perhaps a new status quo after several years of war. Iran and Russia are both looking ahead to 2025 to reposition and reestablish their positions in the Ukraine conflict. The Middle East conflict as well could undergo something of a transformation. Of course, the war in Gaza does continue. A ceasefire there doesn't appear to be likely, at least not in the short term. And Iran is conscious that its confrontation with Israel has moved into a new and potentially more dangerous status quo following the April exchange, following the unprecedented direct Iranian strike against Israel. So Iran is likely looking to solidify and even expand its relationship with Russia, even as Russia potentially repositions itself in the event of some kind of diplomatic progress in Ukraine. At the same time, you have seen a shift in Iran's foreign policy priorities. The election of the new government of Masoud Pezeshkian, which has repeatedly emphasized its desire to seek sanctions relief via negotiations with the West, and recent comments from Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and others suggest that the emphasis from Tehran moving into 2025 might be towards diplomacy, might be towards engagement. That, however, I think does largely depend on the outcome of the election in the United States. There is much less scope, perhaps no scope, for diplomacy between the United States and Iran in the event that Donald Trump is elected president.
Are they in some ways, maybe, is Iran potentially anticipating a Trump win and they're looking for those sanctions relief while the Biden-Harris administration is still in power? What do you make of that?
Well, I think, if they could get sanctions relief, I'm pretty certain the Islamic Republic of Iran would take it. Supreme Leader Khamenei would take it. I don't think there's much scope for anything while Biden remains president. This administration, the Biden administration, has tried to, at least before October 7th, tried to keep the Middle East quiet. Didn't really try to do very much following the collapse of talks to return to the JCPOA in 2022. Really was trying to, as far as I could tell, slow walk the progress of diplomacy with Iran. There was, of course, some minimal progress made. There was a prisoner exchange in September, a certain informal arrangement. But the attitude of the Biden administration in its first and, I guess, only term was to make minimal progress on Iran, to kind of kick the can down the road and see what was possible after the U.S. election. Viewing the Harris administration or potential Harris administration as something of a continuation of the Biden administration, I think we can expect that stance to continue. I don't think we can expect any progress, certainly no substantive progress, on U.S.-Iran diplomacy until after the election and in the event that Harris is elected. Now, I think the leadership in Tehran is conscious that the odds remain good that Donald Trump could very well be reelected. I think the attitude in Tehran is likely to be one of strategic patience that we've seen from Khamenei and others in the past. They've endured 5-6 years of heavy sanctions. They perhaps are willing to endure 4 more years rather than try to negotiate with an American leader who is viewed very negatively in Tehran, to say the least. So I think they've pinned their hopes on a Harris win. We could potentially see some attempt at diplomacy because, as I mentioned, there is a strong desire to pursue sanctions relief in Tehran, a desire that is apparently shared by both Khamenei and Pezeshkian and other members of the government. But I don't see much scope for progress under Trump. If he is elected, I think the attitude in Tehran will be, let's kick the can down the road 4 more years and hope that the regional position doesn't change, the Iran security position doesn't change in a way that forces the nuclear program to escalate potentially close to weaponization.
Now, going back to Russia, there are rumors swirling that Russia has and is supplying pro-Iran groups. What is your knowledge of that?
So pro-Iran groups, as in members of the resistance, the so-called
the axis of resistance, exactly.
That's right, indeed. Yes, in regards to reports that Russia is potentially or very likely supporting the Houthis in Yemen, I think this speaks to the nature of this sort of so-called resistance front axis and the way in which our perception of it has evolved over the last 10 months. I am increasingly pushing back a little, I would say, on the framing of groups such as the Houthis as proxies of Iran. I think this crisis, and I really think the way in which Iran's foreign policy has developed since the death of Qasem Soleimani in 2020 has emphasized a certain decentralization of this resistance front coalition. Groups like the Houthis have seized opportunities, have expanded their profiles, have expanded their propaganda, media campaigns, have also increased their own material strength. The Houthis have solidified their control over roughly half of Yemen and seem to be emerging as a power in and of themselves with their own interests. Now, do they look to Tehran for guidance? Do they receive support from Tehran, material support, weapons, etc.? Absolutely. And this gives Iran a degree of leverage over groups such as the Houthis. Similar leverage is exercised over the militias in Iraq, which in many cases were formed and created wholesale by the IRGC and other entities of the Iranian government. But I think what we've learned over the last 10 months is that these groups do operate to a certain extent autonomously, which is to say they are likely interested in forming relationships beyond their axis with Tehran. Enter Russia. Enter a similarly internationally isolated actor, one that is flush with weaponry and often desires to act as a spoiler or a state looking to expand its regional influence or its influence beyond its traditional sphere, given its new and more isolated status. I don't find it too surprising that Moscow would be interested in cultivating relations with the Houthis, and it makes me curious as to whether they are looking to expand their influence elsewhere. Of course, Russia has had a historical interest in Syria. It's possible that Russia may look for inroads in places such as Iraq, even Lebanon. Could potentially see Russian attempts to spread their influence. So I think this continues our understanding of the resistance front, the axis of resistance, however you want to call it, and perhaps helps nuance it beyond the conventional understanding of these groups as proxies or entities controlled directly by Tehran.
That's really interesting. So how would the IRGC be feeling about that? And would that change or influence the dynamic in terms of the relationship then between Russia and Iran itself? And also, would the IRGC or the Iranian regime want to be sending loads of money to those proxy groups if they can't control them?
Exactly. I mean, if there is a challenge or if there is an attempt by Russia to sort of horn in on Iran's territory, this does suggest friction within the Iran-Russia relationship. It does suggest that there is something of a ceiling, perhaps, on the degree of cooperation that Russia and Iran can enjoy. I think emphasizing the IRGC as an organization, not simply an element of Iran's government, but as an organization in and of itself that has cultivated these groups, that has used them to expand its regional influence.
And controls much of the government to itself, right? I mean, the IRGC is extremely powerful, yeah.
While it has increased its power within the Islamic Republic. I mean, there is an emerging, I'm not sure if it's a consensus, but there is an emerging understanding that when Khamenei dies, whatever new status quo, whatever new balance emerges in Tehran is likely to be one where the guards sort of hold the keys, if you like. They are a central organization, and they are one that they have their own interests, they have an ideology that sort of fits their position. And if they don't feel as though they continue to control or continue to exercise direct influence over these groups, could it potentially change their attitude on other fronts? You know, one relationship between different areas of deterrence that I've been thinking about is the balance that is struck between Iran's cultivating these allies, these resistance front groups, and Iran's approach to the nuclear program. If the IRGC feels that the groups of the resistance front are slipping out of their fingers and potentially weakening a source of deterrence that Iran has leaned on up until this point, could that potentially change the perception of the nuclear program? Could it change the attitudes towards nuclear weaponization or the need to develop a stronger nuclear deterrent if other sources of deterrence have weakened? Now, on the flip side, a relationship with Russia, a nuclear power, one, as I mentioned, has a conventional military that is far more powerful than Iran's, offers another source of deterrence. Could there be a shift away from backing these regional groups to embracing a closer alignment with Russia, even as Russia attempts to develop its own relationship with these groups? There's a number of very interesting factors that could end up changing or evolving Iran's foreign policy, particularly in the context of succession and a change in the leadership at the very top.
So speaking of you mentioned the death of the supreme leader. I mean, he's 85 years old. It's bound to happen one day. Are you saying that we're going to see the militarization of Iran through the IRGC?
That's one way of putting it. I think there are certainly trends that suggest the IRGC is likely to only increase in power and influence. The sanctions regime has allowed organizations and companies controlled by the Guards to expand their profile within Iran's economy. Sanctions have created opportunities for smuggling, for managing a black market in which the IRGC controls a significant portion. The IRGC itself, as an institution, has expanded its control over areas of Iranian media, the sort of Iranian culture space, while at the same time rival institutions seem to have fallen by the wayside. Varying political factions, be they the reformists, who seem to have sort of run out of steam in many cases, the Pezeshkian presidency sort of serving as an illustration of how far the reformist movement has sort of fallen. The clerics as well losing legitimacy in the eyes of the people over issues such as hijab, the morality police, and other areas. The Guards could emerge as the force that holds the Islamic Republic together, that potentially moves things in, as you say, a more militarized direction. There's already been a militarization of foreign policy, things that have been pointed out by figures such as former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, that the foreign ministry no longer controls Iran's foreign policy. The policy is now made by the Guards and the National Security Council. All of these are trends that have grown over the last 5 to 10 years, and given the power of the Guards, and given the lack of an individual who has Khamenei's prestige and his standing, when he dies, there will be a vacuum. There will be a succession crisis, struggle, unclear how destabilizing or violent it may be, but when the smoke clears, when the dust settles, whatever new political status quo exists within the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is likely one in which the IRGC has a significant standing, a significant influence, greater perhaps than any other individual or organization that still exists.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely going to be another turning point, if you will, in Iran's modern history. Let's talk Syria now. When it comes to the dynamic between Russia and Iran, obviously they both have influence on the Assad regime. But could there be some friction? Would they be fighting over just how much influence they can have in Syria?
I think it's an interesting dynamic to keep in mind as Syria slowly emerges from over a decade of war, a decade of civil war. It's a situation that remains unresolved. More than a third of the country is controlled by groups beyond the Assad regime. There, of course, are the Kurds in the northeast, backed by the United States. There remain separatist rebels that control pockets of the country. Russia has an interest in maintaining its position in Syria, as it has done for decades, even before the fall of the Soviet Union. Iran sees Syria as an existential interest. Maintaining the position of the Assad government, of course, has been something that the Islamic Republic has been working towards ever since the beginning of the war, and it's one that Tehran will continue to regard as being very important. I think so far Moscow and Tehran have been able to work a modus vivendi for themselves in order not to step on their toes. The new factor is Assad's reintegration in the Arab community. Attempt at overtures from the Gulf, from other governments in the region, suggest that sooner or later Assad will be brought back into the fold, and that efforts will be made to stabilize Syria's internal economic structure after such a long period of instability. This suggests that the greatest challenge to Iran is probably not one from Moscow. It is probably one from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. There are things that the Gulf can offer: money, investment opportunities, perhaps the relief from onerous U.S. or Western sanctions, the ability of Assad to be renormalized and reintegrated into the international community in general is a path that runs through the Gulf. It does not run through Tehran. This does not suggest to me that Tehran is going to lose its position. It's too important to Assad, and Assad is too important to Tehran. But it does suggest that Iran's position of influence in Syria may come under some pressure if the Gulf does decide to proceed with stabilizing the Assad regime and normalizing relations with Damascus. It's a little bit too soon to tell, but I do see things trending in that direction.
And what would that do with Israel? Because we see a normalization somewhat between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia allegedly gave the U.S. intelligence about the missile strike, the first time that Iran made a direct strike in Israel on April 13th. And we do see a warming of relations, at least behind closed doors, even if they don't admit it on camera because of their own populace. What would that do to the relationship with Israel? And then also the relationship between Russia and Israel. Has Russia, after October 7th, taken a side, so to speak, with Iran?
I think Russia has worked to avoid taking anyone's side. I think that sort of speaks to Putin's desire to avoid an escalation in the wake of the Hania assassination, and the somewhat quiet role that Russia has taken in the crisis in general, considering that it does maintain a presence in Syria, that it does maintain kind of a strategic footprint in the region. I think, given how he has his hands full closer to home, President Putin doesn't really look with favor on any kind of increased instability in the region. As I mentioned, he has this new relationship with Iran that Russia needs, at least for now. And it's a strategic alignment that I don't think Moscow is going to turn its back on. At the same time, somewhat friendly or at least lukewarm or neutral relations with Israel under Netanyahu has helped Putin insofar as it's kept that area quiet. Relations with the Gulf is also something that he cares a lot about, right? Not kicking up a fight with Russia's partners in OPEC Plus, not undermining that market management relationship, which has worked reasonably well over the last number of years. When it comes to Gulf normalization with Israel and the impact that it could have on the region, I really see Saudi Arabia in the driver's seat here. Saudi, if any one state has emerged or is emerging from this crisis in a more prominent position, I think it is Saudi Arabia. I think, given how crucial it seems to be in the U.S. strategic view of the region, under, I think, either a Trump or potentially a Harris administration, I think binding the ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia will be a priority for the next U.S. government. If Saudi Arabia has an interest in normalizing with Assad, using its money, using its resources to try to rebuild Syria, there will likely be some kind of connection with reducing tensions between Syria and Israel, which of course remain in a state of hostility as they have been for the last half century. That will be an element in Saudi policy. At the same time, Saudi wants to maintain the normalization with Iran, keep things quiet in the Persian Gulf, avoid a return to the bad old days of 2019 and 2020, when missiles and drones were raining down on Abqaiq. This is something that Riyadh wants to avoid. We have to remember, in terms of the shifting politics of the region, Mohammed bin Salman is in power in Riyadh and is likely to remain in power for decades to come. The view coming out of Saudi is one of long-term security, long-term economic development. So when it comes to which state is sort of in the driver's seat or which state may sort of hold the keys to pulling things away from this sense of crisis, I think Saudi Arabia is in a prominent position there. But it all comes down to, can a ceasefire in Gaza be reached? Can some kind of de-escalation between Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran be approached? And what role will the United States seek to play in balancing Israel with Saudi and in trying to contain Iran and potentially pursue a new nuclear agreement? All of these things remain up in the air until we see what kind of outcome there will be in November's election.
Very interesting. The dynamics in the Middle East are definitely changing. Let's go up north to the Caucasus. What about Iran's influence there? Here at Iran International, we've been reporting that there's been recently a major arms deal between Iran and Armenia, supplying drones and missiles. And would that essentially jeopardize the relationship between Russia and Iran? What would Russia make of this as Iran is trying to fill that void in that region?
Well, I think the Caucasus remain an element that Russia and Iran have been able to sort of overlook as they've been growing closer together. Of course, Iran has this historic relationship with Armenia, which has suffered from the result of its wars with Azerbaijan. Iran wants to maintain its position in the Caucasus, but it's also made an effort to improve relations with Baku. I think from Iran's point of view, trying to keep things as stable as possible in the Caucasus serves its interests and serves this kind of general view that Iran was approaching the region with before October 7th, which was to try to keep everything quiet. I think largely in the view that if a succession crisis were to happen, if Khamenei was to die, and there was to be a greater amount of internal instability, the fewer foreign policy crises, the fewer border crises or regional crises that Tehran had to face, the better. And the Caucasus features within that. Now, will Iran change its relationship with Yerevan? I don't think so. I think maintaining that relationship with Armenia is too important. As I mentioned, Iran sees itself as being surrounded by powerful enemies, doesn't have many friends, and the relatively close relations that they've been able to strike with Armenia sort of help to balance that. At the same time, Iran has a new identity for itself, which is as an arms dealer, as a weapons manufacturer. It's had great success selling drones to Russia. It's attempting to sell drones elsewhere. Dealings with Armenia could potentially open up additional markets for Iran's weapons, for its drones and other weapon systems. So there's an element of that as well. But as far as balancing the relationship with Russia, so far Moscow and Tehran have been relatively successful, I would say, at keeping their positions at sort of opposing ends of the Caucasus conflict from undermining their new alignment.
In 2022, the Pentagon said that there are Iranian military personnel on the ground in Crimea assisting Russia. What is your knowledge of that?
I don't know much about that, and I don't know how confident we can be that Iran has been willing to put boots on the ground, so to speak, in either Russia or Ukraine. There have, of course, been leaks and reports about Iran's efforts to assist Russia in building a drone factory, that there have been considerable negotiations and arguments, in fact, over the terms of that agreement. I find it a little bit hard to believe that Iran would be willing to send individuals, technical support or otherwise, to a place like Crimea, given how well-positioned Russia itself is in maintaining control over Crimea. I mean, we have to remember that Russia is a great power. Russia has a considerable military, a conventional military that is far more powerful than Iran's. It's not the Houthis or Hezbollah or other Iranian proxies. So in the sense of what Iran needs from Russia, what Russia needs from Iran, it's less technical expertise and technical support and more arms. Weapons that can be diverted into the meat grinder of the war in Ukraine. And I would also note that this war in Ukraine that's been dragging on for years now does seem to be going in a direction that favors Russia. That Russia has weathered the storm of Western sanctions relatively well, that it has advantages in both manpower and resources over Kyiv, and that if it reaches a point in 2025, as I mentioned, where there is an attempt at a cessation at hostilities or potentially some kind of ceasefire, then Russia's need for support from Iran may change. It may diminish, and this could have an impact on the degree to which Iran is able to use its leverage or its influence to exert increased concessions from Moscow. So some things could change next year, and it could reflect in Iran's new relationship with Moscow.
Speaking of the relationship, wasn't there a security pact that Russia and Iran were supposed to sign a month ago, but it never happened? Do you know anything about that?
Yes, no, it's interesting. Like, in the sense of what precisely have the two governments agreed to do for one another, this continues to draw considerable debate. The degree to which there is any kind of commitment from Moscow to provide Iran with intelligence support, cooperation in covert operations, military equipment. There has long been reports that Russia is poised to send advanced jet fighter aircraft, Su-35s, to Iran to supplement Iran's air force, which overwhelmingly relies on aircraft that are more than 30 or 40 years old. These Su-35s have yet to emerge. They've yet to appear. Has yet to be any confirmation that Russia has sent them or even intends to send them. So the degree to which this relationship remains opaque, that it remains unclear to outsiders such as ourselves, precisely what kind of relationship has been formed between Moscow and Tehran and how far they've agreed to go, gives us, it sort of keeps us in the dark as far as really understanding the extent of this relationship. But it's unquestionably a relationship that has advanced considerably since 2022 and is likely to continue to advance even as the regional context changes.
Now, with Ukraine making some gains and essentially taking the war back into the country that launched it, do you see Russia as being, quote unquote, on the defensive? And would you see Iran being on the defensive now after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran?
I think Iran is probably on the defensive at the moment. Iran's attitude or stance towards the crisis in the region has been largely one of reaction, largely one of defending its position. It benefits from Israel being bogged down in a domestic security crisis. It benefited from the Hamas attack on Israel to the extent that Israel is now fighting a war in Gaza, seems to be fighting a war in the north. It could potentially even be dragged into fighting a larger conflagration in the West Bank. All of this sort of helps Iran in the sense of keeping its most powerful regional opponent bogged down. At the same time, Iran has taken hits to its own position. It's deterred by U.S. conventional military power and is likely deterred by Israeli military power as well. And Iran wants to avoid a regional war that could do considerable damage to its position. Now, in the sense of the war in Ukraine, I think the Ukrainian offensive into Russia has pulled resources away and has pulled attentions away from other parts of the front. I think my understanding is that Russia has been making gains of its own inside Ukraine, in the Donetsk region, that the balance of advantages, that the balance of power in Ukraine has shifted in Russia's favor, that the war is either going to continue in some kind of stalemate or could potentially be moving in a position that benefits Russia over the medium to long term. So in that sense, I don't think Russia has been put on the defensive. If anything, Russia appears to be making gains of its own. And I think, in terms of who has the resources to wage a long-term struggle, I think the balance is tipped in Russia's favor. So it remains to be seen precisely where the war will head over the next 6 to 12 months, but Russia doesn't seem to be on the ropes quite to the same extent that it was even a year ago.
And will the outcome of that in any way impact what we're seeing in the Middle East right now?
I'm not totally sure. I think the war in Ukraine is overwhelmingly the focus of Russia, of its foreign policy, of its military. I think it's, without a doubt, the most important issue facing Vladimir Putin. I think the Middle East, it's not a secondary concern, but it is a concern in the sense that he's trying to keep it quiet and he's trying to keep Russia's position there relatively stable. As I mentioned, trying to keep everybody happy. If the war in Ukraine comes to a more firm conclusion, in the sense that there is some kind of agreed upon settlement, there are some, new lines are drawn on the map to an extent that Russia feels comfortable pulling troops and resources away, that could potentially change Russia's attitude and its position in the Middle East. But at this point, I should caveat it by saying we know from the reports that the United States and Europe have made available, the war in Ukraine has been devastating to Russia's military. It has taken hundreds of thousands of losses. It's lost billions, the equivalent of billions of dollars in material. Its economy has taken a considerable hit. I don't see Russia embracing a more adventurous foreign policy anytime soon. If anything, it may spend a few years licking its wounds and rebuilding after a war that has undoubtedly been much costlier than Putin first imagined in February of 2022.
And Iran recently congratulated Ukraine on their Independence Day. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. What did you make of that?
Well, it sort of goes to a point I made before, which is that the situation in Ukraine could change in 2025. There could be, if not a settlement, then perhaps some kind of cessation of hostilities, even a short-term one. The new Iranian government of Masoud Pezeshkian, as I also mentioned, is making its priority improving relations with the West, pursuing sanctions relief through a new deal with the United States, sending overtures or some kind of congratulations or some positive message to Kyiv could be an attempt to change the nature of the relationship. Now, will Kyiv look upon it in the same way? I tend to doubt it. I think the Ukrainians will have no love for the Iranians, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But from the point of view of Iran, even a fig leaf, even an attempt to extend an olive branch, suggests some sense that the relationship could change, and that Iran is perhaps conscious that its role in the war in Ukraine has undermined or impacted any scope that it might have for diplomacy with the West or diplomacy with the United States, and that it may seek to change that. I should emphasize that the United States has taken the public position that diplomacy with Iran is not possible, and has often cited Iran's support for Russia's war in Ukraine as a considerable roadblock. So if Iran were to take steps suggesting it's scaling back its support for Russia's war in Ukraine, it could be in service of opening up the scope for diplomacy with the U.S. So far, we haven't seen any concrete signs of that. We'll simply have to wait and see.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Thank you so much, Greg. I've learned a lot from you. That was a really fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You can always weigh in on the discussion in the comments below and hit the like button. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.